So in John 11, I wanted to do, and we're not going to do the whole actual raising of Lazarus, but this is something I always think about when a loved one is lost. And, we always think about, as Christians, we have hope for what comes after this life, right? And that's the one thing that distinguishes, Christians from atheists, is that you have that hope. And so, as an atheist, once you die, that's it. What you've done here. And listen, it is a noble point. Let me just point out that when you die, you are remembered by the things that you do in this life, right? And that is a positive there, that point. However, the lack of hope for the future and the life after this life, that's a sad state of affairs when it is all what you do in this life and there's nothing after that. And so I wanted to look at John 11 and point out some things that maybe you don't think about, kind of put this in context, which is my favorite thing. And so starting at John 11:1, it says, "Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with anointment and wiped his feet." It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sister sent to him, saying, "Lord, he whom you love is ill." But when Jesus heard it, he said, "This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Now, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Notice it says that he loved them all, right? So when he heard that Lazarus was ill, he ran right there to save him, right? No. He stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. And that's funny because that seems like a contradiction, right? Then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again," right? And so note that it says clearly again that he stays longer, but he loved them, right? And so clearly there's something going on there. The problem is the expectation. So Jesus needs to accomplish a task, right? And it's going to be a spectacular task. It's going to be the culmination of all the signs, or the climax of all of the signs, right? In the Gospel of John, all of the miracles are signs, and all of those signs point to Jesus as the Messiah, right? John very specifically picks the miracles that he points out in order to show that Jesus is the Messiah. So, for instance, the first one, what's the first miracle that Jesus does in the Gospel of John? Water into wine, right? And you think, well, what does that mean, right? Well, in the Old Testament, during the Messianic age, it says that wine will flow like water, right? And so when Jesus turns water into wine, it's a fulfillment of that, right? It's like saying the Messianic age is upon us, right? And so all of those signs in the Gospel of John, they're there for a point to show that Jesus is the Messiah. So the expectation is, if Jesus goes to Lazarus and he's sick, what is he going to do? He's going to heal him, right? And what would we do if he came and said, "Well, not yet, wait for it. We got to wait for him to die. But trust me, you're going to understand." That's not going to go well, right? People are going to be a little, perturbed by that. And so he wouldn't be able to accomplish the task that he has, which is to produce this miraculous deed that he has planned. So then they tell him, basically, they're like, "Look, last time you were there in Judea, they tried to kill you. So we don't need to go back there because, And so he said, "No, we're going." So then you skip to 11. And it says, "After saying these things, he said to them, 'Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him.' The disciples said to him, 'Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover.' Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking rest and sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, 'Lazarus has died. And for your sake, I am glad that I was not there, so that you may believe, but let us go to him.'" So note again, he says for their sake, he's glad that he wasn't there when he died. So again, the point being, if he had been there, he would have just had to heal him right there on the spot. He wouldn't have died. You wouldn't have gotten to see this spectacular miracle that's about to take place. And so therefore, for your sake, for their faith, he chose not to be there, right? And there's a little more to it, and we'll get there in a minute. Note that when you read the Gospel of John, you have this consistent theme of misunderstanding, where people don't understand what Jesus is talking about. Like, for instance, when he talks about tear down this temple and I will raise it in 3 days, and he's talking about, it says clearly in John, it says, but he was talking about his body, and they misunderstand and think that he's talking about the temple. Well, John does that on purpose. He points out all of those times of misunderstanding as a literary technique. In other words, he purposely points those out. That's why you get a lot of that in the Gospel of John. And in this case, of course, the misunderstanding has to do with the euphemism for death, which is falling asleep, which is a fairly natural thing. If he is simply asleep, he's resting, chances are he's going to get better. So why would you wake him up, right? And Jesus is like, he's dead, like he died. And they're like, oh, okay. Okay, and again, to point out that he explains that he's died, and he's glad that he wasn't there to witness that, so that he didn't get kind of pushed into a miracle before it needed to be done. So at 11:17, it says, now when Jesus came, he found Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days. Okay, now that's important, because in Judaism, after 3 days, you were good and dead, right? In other words, they had beliefs concerning, and listen, it probably comes from people resuscitating, that they thought were dead or whatever. And listen, sometimes we look down on, the ancient people and think, oh, they're like savages. I mean, just for the record, they were fairly smart about things, and so they generally would know. But I mean, look, even to this day, you have people like, what was the lady not long ago? And I mean, of course, it wasn't in the United States, but it was somewhere else where I think she was knocking on the casket as they were getting ready to bury her, like it was in South America or Africa or somewhere. And so, I mean, it happens, right? So that we think somebody might be dead and they're not. So I would assume, and I didn't research that part, I would assume that that's the case, that people had, resuscitated. And so, they make sure. And so the point of waiting 4 days is that when Jesus goes and performs this miracle, there's absolutely no chance that he's just resuscitated Lazarus. He has risen him from the dead. Like, there's no chance, right? So then at 11:18, Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So interestingly, and this is just a quick aside, so in the ancient world, in this time period, and a Jewish family, and they would have, because they seem to be pretty well off, so it would have been standard in the Mishnah, which is Jewish writings from just after Jesus' time. So basically what happens is you have all these rabbis, and they sit around and they write about the law, right? And so they write all this stuff down and they interpret the law. And so this is written down probably 200 years after Jesus, maybe a little longer. But it is assumed that some of the stuff that they're writing about is the same beliefs that they had during Jesus' time, right? I mean, in other words, you can't guarantee that, but it's pretty obvious. So for instance, you get things like the law says that you can't work on Sunday, right? Well, what constitutes work, right? We don't know. It's what we would call today case law, right? So you have the legislation that the legislatures do, but then you have cases that test all of those laws, right? And so that's what they're doing. They're testing the laws. They're saying, okay, well, the law says that you can't work on Sunday, but what is work? Well, so they spell it out for you. And so one of the laws said, and I don't remember exactly what the incliner is, whatever, but you can walk up an incline this steep, but you can't walk up an incline this steep, right? You can't climb up rocks and such. You can't walk certain surfaces and things like that. So they want to make sure. And this seems to be the type of what we call Pharisaic law that Jesus is talking about. When he talks about adding to the laws, we assume that this that is eventually written down 200 or 300 years later is the type of stuff that Jesus is talking about. One of my favorites is, sadly enough, is Moses says that you can only divorce your wife with cause, right? So, or for cause. Well, the Mishnah helps us out with that, just in case we don't know what cause is. And the Mishnah stipulates that if she burns your bread, then that's cause, right? And so you can understand where Jesus would be unhappy with this type of, extreme, reinterpretation of the law. So in the Mishnah, they have they talk about it, and they say that even a poor family at a funeral would have at least one instrument, and I think it's either 2 or 4 professional wailers, right? And so you would hire people to come and scream and cry and stuff at the funeral, right? And so that's just one of those things that they did. So when you have all these people here, and in light of the fact that we've just had a visitation and everything, and of course we had the luncheon and stuff today, they would have certainly done those things. They would have. So the person dies, right, and then they have to be buried in that day, and then for the next 6 days, you have the most extreme time of the mourning period, right? And so that would be the time when you would have your professional mourners and such that would be there. But of course, you would have your family and your friends and stuff would come over. They would bring food, just like today a good Baptist does, right? You would do similar things to the way we do it today, but of course they would come and they would do it at the home and all. And while I'm there, I might as well go ahead and finish out that discussion. So what does it mean to be buried, right? So to be buried in this time period as a Jewish person, basically you would die. They would take your body, they would anoint it in oils and everything. They would wrap it, just like it describes Jesus, right? And then they would take you, and certainly in Jesus' case, and in Lazarus' case, they would put you in a cave, right, or a tomb, and they would put you on a shelf, basically, right? So they'd have shelves cut out, they'd put you on a shelf, and then you would stay there for a year. And then your body would decay, and then you would have, you would have your bones and stuff would be left. And then we talked about this not terribly long ago. And then they would put you in this bone box, and I'll give you 50,000 non-existent bonus points if you can tell me what that bone box is called.
Ossuary.
An ossuary. Good job. And does anybody remember the famous ossuary that we have? We actually have 2. One might be famous. The other one is definitely famous.
James.
So James, the brother of Jesus, that might be his ossuary. We think very possibly. Do you remember the other one? This very decorative. Caiaphas, right? Caiaphas, the high priest. We know for a fact we have his ossuary, right? So James, the brother of Jesus, as we talked about in the past, it is very possible. Like they tried to prove that it did not say James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus, right? Which is very unusual. It would say James, son of Joseph, but it wouldn't say a brother unless the brother was famous. The fact that it says the brother of Jesus tells you that the brother Jesus in that instance is someone well known. There's no decorations or anything on that ossuary, and so it seems to be possible. But let me just point out that James, Joseph, and Jesus are all very common names. Mary, strangely enough, being the most common female name in this time period. That's why you have so many Marys. And so your bones would be put in that bone box, and then that's where you would be, you would stay permanently. Okay, so I'm just going to start back at 11:18. Yeah.
We skipped over verse 16.
I skipped over the verses that weren't specifically, yes, I skipped over the verses that weren't specifically related to what we're talking about. Read verse 16 and we'll talk about it.
Said, then Thomas, who is called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, let us also go, that we may die with him.
Yeah, so remember they've just warned him, and we didn't read that part either. They've just warned him that if he goes, then they're going to attack him. And keep in mind, they still think he's a warrior king, right? And so he's saying, oh, he's going to die in battle is probably what he assumes. And so so he's like, hey, we'll go fight as well. Just like Peter, he still pulls out his sword and tries to fight, So yeah, that's it. All right, so starting back at 11:18, Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, but Mary remained seated in the house. So that seems like, why is she staying behind? Well, because she's staying there with the family and the people that are there. It would have been a major faux pas for her just to leave, even though she does eventually just leave. But she's staying there because she's the hostess. She has to be the hostess for the people that are there to visit. Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Is that true? I mean, likely. Is it likely true? Right? It's likely true, right? He certainly could have done something. But what does that assume now? That he can't do anything now. It's too late, right? And I know some of you are probably looking ahead and thinking, no, but the next verse, right? All right, yeah, that's funny. You all did that, right?
If he had been there, he would have healed him.
Exactly. Yes, that's definitely right. Yes, and that's the whole point, right? And that's what she's saying is, why weren't you here to heal my brother? Now he's dead, right?
He couldn't prove his point by being there and then waiting for 3 days, 4 days.
That's exactly right. But even now, I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you, right? Did all that. So she clearly believes, obviously, that he could have healed Lazarus, right? But the question is, does she believe that he can raise him from the dead? And that verse seems like she might think that. However, verses 23 through 24, and wait till we get there. Look at y'all reading it. 23 and 24 seem to exclude that idea. And certainly when she tells him, don't move the stone away because he's been there, he's going to stink. Clearly she's not of the mind that it's obvious that Jesus is going to be able to bring him back to life, right? So whatever exactly she means, whether he's going to comfort them in some sort of way or whatever it may be, she doesn't seem to at least be fully on board with the idea that he's going to come in and raise Lazarus from the dead. So then at 23 through 24, Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. And so she is talking about the Jewish hope of the resurrection at the end of all time, right? And so for Jewish people at this time, remember we've talked about this in the past, they didn't have a full understanding of, the afterlife as far as heaven and hell and stuff that you get in the New Testament. But they did have an idea stemming from the end of Daniel 12, I believe it is, about the resurrection of the dead. And the intertestamental period, you do have some more stuff about resurrection that they kind of start thinking through the idea of resurrection. But that's only for the righteous, right? So the righteous people, they will eventually be resurrected. That's the way they believe. And so that's what she's bringing up. She's saying, well, I get that he's going to be resurrected at the end of all times. And Jesus is saying, no, it's more exciting than that, right? So then at 25 through 37, did I skip? Yeah, that's right. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? Note that he says he is the resurrection and the life. The argument behind that is he has control over death. He has supremacy over death. He controls who lives or dies. And whoever believes in him shall never die, right? And so that's the argument that Jesus is making. Well, that's going to take some pretty spectacular evidence for him to prove that, which is exactly what he's here to do. That's the point. Jesus is promising that there's life after death, and now he just needs to prove it. And once he does the spectacular miracle, they all look and say, oh my gosh, he does have control over death. So therefore, what he says about life after death must be true. The promises that Jesus makes about hope for the afterlife have to be true based on the fact that he's able to do this spectacular miracle. That's the point that he's making here. That's what all of this is about. She said to him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Christ, the Son of God." Remember, Christ just means Messiah, the anointed one. "The Son of God who is coming into the world." When she had said this, she went and called her sister Mary, saying in private, "The teacher is here and is calling for you." And when she heard it, she arose quickly and went to him. Now, what has Jesus always told people when he's done fairly spectacular miracles? And everybody hears about them, but generally what does he say? Don't tell anybody, right? My time has not yet come, right? So now they're still keeping it secret, like they're talking kind of in hushed voices, like, hey, Jesus is here and he's going to do this thing. And of course, they're already threatened to kill him. And so it's kind of hush hush. But what is he going to do? He's going to go out in front of all these people, including specifically, it says the Jews who were with them. He's going to do the spectacular thing in front of everyone. And so, whereas Jesus has been kind of keeping low, this is the point at which he begins. And listen, if you read a commentary, an academic commentary on John, they will basically make this the first part of the Passion Week. It's when he raises Lazarus from the dead that the Jewish officials finally say, okay, he's got to die, right? And so that begins the second half with or right before the second half, where now they're trying to kill him and he goes and moves into the Passion Week. So this is the point at which he does this in front of everyone. It's finally his time, right? So he makes this huge point right here at this moment, and he's saying, my time has finally come. And when she heard it, she arose quickly and went to him. Now, Jesus had not yet come into the village, but was still in the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews, interestingly, it is interesting that note that Martha goes out and then goes back, and then Mary goes, and so it does seem like one of them stayed. I don't think it says that they're both there at one time, but they did. It sounds like one of them always stayed to make sure they were there with the guests, which again would have been a big deal. But you think Jesus is here, like, let's just bring everybody. When the Jews who were with her in the house, consoling her, saw Mary rise quickly and go out, they followed her, supposing that she was going to the tomb to weep there. Now, when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." So again, same point. Everybody close to the family clearly is of the understanding Jesus messed up. He should have been here earlier. He could have fixed this. Now what are we going to do, right? When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus wept. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept this man from dying?" Same thing, right? So now what we're going to look at, and this is what we've been waiting on, the moment we've been waiting on, two things that seem obvious but are not. And I think when we talk about it, you're going to realize that it's totally different than what you originally thought. So note at verse 33, these are the things that we need to look at. At verse 33, it says, when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved, so that's important, in his spirit and greatly troubled, right? And then Jesus wept. So what's that all about? And then some of you think, well, his friend died and all these people are crying, right? And I get it, right? But it's not just that. And then they say, see how he loved him, right? So they're saying he's crying because Lazarus died, right? But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man also have kept him from dying? So again, they believe that he could have done something if he had been here.
Could he have been weeping because of their unbelief?
Okay, so that is one of the arguments, but that's what we're talking about. So the word that is behind that deeply moved in the spirit. So interestingly, that word is used when we talk about horses going into war, or if they're going in a race and they snort like they're agitated, or they're preparing themselves or whatever. Like, yeah, it's like that, and it almost like a grunt, right? And so that's what that word is, and that's where it's used. Interestingly, whenever it's used of people, it always means anger, right? Specifically, it means outrage, fury, or anger, okay? And so deeply moved is a translator looking and saying, okay, well, I mean, the word means angry, outraged, fury, but I mean, he's at a funeral, so we're just going to say deeply moved, right? And that's just not it. That's just not what it means. It means that he's angry. And he's greatly troubled. And again, the same thing. That literally means that he shook himself, right? And so literally what the translation would be is that he got angry and shook himself. So that's how it actually comes out, right? So why is he angry? And so that's your question, and that is one of the interpretations. I disagree with it, however, though some do agree with it. And they'll say, okay, it's because listen. So Jesus wept, right? And we'll talk about these two at the same time. Jesus is about to raise Lazarus from the dead, right? Now, clearly, it is emotional when you're around people who are upset. But if he's about to raise him from the dead, like he's thinking, these people are upset now, but in a minute, they're going to be jumping with joy, right? And so he's not weeping with them because he's sad. And note that that's the interpretation that the Jews who are with him have is, see how he loved Lazarus. He's clearly not crying over Lazarus because he's about to bring him back to life, right? And it says he's angry and then he wept. So what's the deal? So many will say that he's angry and weeps over their unbelief, that he can do this thing, right? And certainly that's possible, but I don't know that we would fault anyone for that, since they've really not seen that level of spectacular. I mean, listen, Jesus has done spectacular miracles, right? But nobody understands Jesus at this point. Nobody understands Jesus until after his death and resurrection, right? And so to sit here and think that, for Jesus to be like, I can't believe that they don't believe that I'm going to bring him back to life. I mean, that's, that it seems a little harsh, and I'm not saying Jesus can't be harsh, but that seems a little harsh. Other scholars, and some will say it's both, will say that it is this whole scene that Jesus is angry at, right? And the reason that he weeps. And it's the fact that death has such a control over humanity, right? When we look at death, even as Christians today who have the whole story, we understand Jesus now, at least, as much as we need to understand salvation and basic afterlife, right? However, even today, when we have death, and listen, there's nothing wrong with mourning the loss of a loved one, right? I mean, obviously, and Jesus is not saying that you can't mourn the loss of a loved one, but we just can't get to a point to where we don't think in terms of the hope of the hereafter, where we're going to see those people again, right? If we treat every death as though that's just it, that's the end, I'm never going to see this person again, with just endless hopelessness, that's a problem. And this is what Jesus seems to be. I'm not going to be dogmatic here, right? But this seems to be more what Jesus is dealing with, is that whole idea, because listen, that's the point. He's come to defeat death, right? And here he has on full display the hold that death has over people, right? And the hopelessness, again, that people have. And listen, those Jewish people, they did have hopelessness in general. Like she does say, hey, I believe there's going to be a resurrection. And that's pretty spectacular belief system. But in general, particularly when you're in the Old Testament, Judaism has no afterlife promise. And so there is that hopelessness, the same hopelessness that you would have if you were an atheist, right? And so Jesus is weeping over that. He's angry about that whole idea that this is it, and this person is gone, and there's nothing that can be done. And Jesus is here to say, I'm here to correct that. I'm here to fix that to where there will not be hopelessness over death anymore, because he's come to defeat death himself. One scholar, John Burge, he says this. He says, but what arouses Jesus' anger? Why is he outraged in the deepest level of his being? He is certainly not angry at Mary, at Martha, Mary, or the mourners, right? Just for the record, he believes that. It's Gary Burge, not John. It's Gary Burge, and he believes that, but just for the record, many scholars will argue that he's angry at them. Rather, he is overcome by the futility of this sorrowful scene in light of the reality of the resurrection. God's people possess knowledge of life. They should possess a faith that claims victory at the grave. But here they stand, overcome in seeming defeat. And here stands the one in whom victory, life, and resurrection are powerful realities. Jesus is angry at death itself and the devastation it brings. His only interest now is to locate the tomb and begin to demonstrate divine power over humanity's foe, right? And so I certainly couldn't say that better than that. So Jesus has come to defeat death, right? And says as much right there. When he comes in and defeats death in the short term for Lazarus, this shows that he does have that power over death. So when he talks about everlasting life after this mortal life, we can be assured that what he says is true because he's proven it, that he has the power over death. This is the promise and the hope that we as Christians have. Paul makes the same argument to the Thessalonians who were concerned about those who have already passed in 1 Thessalonians 4:13 through 14. And listen, there's a lot of misunderstanding about this passage because it talks about those who are already in the grave will go first, and then it talks about those who are still alive. Well, the problem in Thessalonica is that you have all these new Christians, and the hope is that they're going to get to see Jesus return. Because listen, as I've said before, and I'll say it again, every generation, including Jesus's own disciples and all of those people, believed that they were living in the time that Jesus would return, right? Now again, let me say, could Jesus return right now? Yes. Absolutely he could. He absolutely could. Who was it? Zach Goforth that said that day that, listen, there is nothing that needs to happen for Jesus to return. He could return at any moment that he wants, right? However, statistically, is Jesus going to return right now? No, because he's not returned in the last 2,000 or so years. Doesn't mean he can't, but for every generation to say, this is the time. And again, I would use the thing. And listen, I'm not saying that Jesus is not going to return in our lifetimes. He may. But listen, when we start thinking about how bad things are, we look at, we always look at the political situation or whatever. I always go back to the Civil War, right? And they absolutely believed that Jesus was going to return during that time because they looked around and they said, there has been no worse time than this. In the United States, there's certainly not been a worse time than that, right? And so they looked and they said, Jesus is going to return any time now, right? And he didn't. And so whenever you look around and see how bad things are, look at the Civil War. Look at World War I. Look at World War II, right? Look at all of the terrible things that have happened at different times, and Jesus didn't return in those times either. Again, I'm not saying he can't, but he hasn't yet. And so what's going on here is we have those at Thessalonica, and they're looking around and they're saying, okay, I'm a Christian, and I expect Jesus is going to return. And then I have all these Christian brethren, and they're dying off. And so wait a minute, are they going to miss out on the promises that we have in Christ as Christians? And what Paul is saying is, no. Those who have died, they're still going to get to be with Christ. They still have all those promises. As a matter of fact, they're the first ones who get to meet Christ, and then you're going to get to meet him as well. If Jesus returns, you'll see him right then, and you'll get to meet him right then. But those who have died first, they get to meet him first, right? And it's simply Paul comforting them, telling them that don't worry about your Christian friends who have died. They are not missing out on any promises. And so he says at 1 Thessalonians 4:13 and 14, but we do not want you to be uninformed, brothers, about those who are asleep, and he does mean dead, that you may not grieve as others do who have no hope. For since we believe that Jesus died and rose again, even so through Jesus, God will bring with him those who have fallen asleep. Again, meaning those who have died, they're going to get to be with Christ, just like we're all going to be with Christ. As long as you believe in Jesus and all the things that he said, all the necessary things, you're going to get to be with Jesus. Nobody's missing out, right? That's the point he's making. He's making the same point that Jesus was making. It's that promise for the life after this life. And he's pointing out to them that their faith is lacking in that they believe that if I die and Jesus hasn't returned, then I'm missing out on something. And he said, no. Those who die, they're going to be with Christ, right? Just like all Christians of all time, you get to be with Christ. Nobody's missing out. Same message that Jesus had. And when he comes in and he brings Lazarus back from the dead and he says, hey, I have control over death. I'm the resurrection and the life. You can have eternal life, right? And everybody's looking saying, I don't know if this guy can really make these, like that's a pretty big, offer, right? And then boom, he brings Lazarus back from the dead. They're like, okay, so what this guy says seems to be spot on. And again, not that Jesus hasn't done several spectacular miracles, but listen, you can do a lot of things and then say, I'm going to raise somebody from the dead. And then, and listen, he's done some long distance miracles and stuff. But this is the most spectacular where there's no doubt, right, that he's brought this man back from the dead. And that is the coup de grace of miracles right here. But thanks for watching, and please feel free to leave a comment or question. And if you found this video helpful, hit like. And if you would like to be notified when new videos are released, hit subscribe and join us next time as we study the Bible in context.